Hey, it's great to be here on June 4th, 2024. Thank you guys for coming out so much. I just wanted to start this program with a little bit of a quote from President Trump a couple of years ago. He asked, why was there a civil war? Well, 999 out of 1,000 people thought, Trump's just being Trump. Everybody knows the war was fought over slavery for the most part. And I would say slavery was probably 70% of the issue. The other 20% of the issue was something known as the buffalo hunts, the intrigues, the Aaron Burr schemes, the filibustering invasions. And the reason we know that is because in 1862, President Abraham Lincoln made two different proclamations, basically. He had the Emancipation Proclamation and also the Homestead Act. So most historians don't really know the real issue why Lincoln implemented the Homestead Act. He didn't want U.S. citizens traveling overseas, invading countries that were at peace with the United States. And many people don't know that history, but I'm going to cover just a little bit of that tonight, and that'll be in my talk mainly for you guys about 8 months from now, April 2025. I'll put another PowerPoint together. So anyway, so this one tonight is about a very minor subject matter that maybe had a minor thing to do with the divide between North and South in the war from 1861 to 65, was the bad water and poor sanitation in Washington, D.C. that led to an incident known as the National Hotel Disease Incident from January through March 1857, where the occupants of the National Hotel, after President James Buchanan's victory for the presidency, before his inauguration, over 300 Democratic political party guests became ill while staying at the National Hotel in downtown Washington, D.C. So it was speculated at the time that a Republican Party operative had either poisoned the guests or done something to the system, the water, that had poisoned all the guests. That resulted in 36 deaths. So we're going to talk about a few of those deaths. And also, in the meantime, the construction of the Washington, D.C. Aqueduct. At the time, they didn't know about the diseases, the transmission of diseases through the water. They didn't know anything about that kind of science. Now, today, we know that 3 U.S. presidents most likely died from poor sanitation and poor water before the Civil War. So I will go through that. And so we'll start off with the map. In year 1921 era, there were 15 free states and 15 slave states. So they had the Missouri Compromise line, which detonated that the area south of the 3630 line could be slave states in the future as territory joined the Union. Now in 1850, the map on the right, so California is admitted to the Union as the 16th free state. So to appease the South, they created something in that time known as the Fugitive Slave Law that would round up the escapees. So one of the interesting things that most people have no idea about is in the middle 1840s, about 1845, Yucatan, which was an independent nation, independent of Mexico at the time, and not together with any of the other Central American republics, it asked to be part of the United States. They said, hey, we want to go with you guys. You are a nation of progress. You are a nation of inventions. You're a nation of railroads, all those kind of things that we don't have. So they wanted to join the United States. They sent a representative. Justo Sierra O'Reilly arrived in 1847 during the middle of the U.S. war with Mexico. And he says, hey, we want to be with you guys. We don't want to be with Mexico. So there was a vote, or they didn't get around to taking the vote because they were in the middle with the war of Mexico, or with Mexico at the time, and it just never came to be. Now, one of the stipulations after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was hacked out in Congress that gave the United States most of Alto, California, and the New Mexico territory, Yucatan was forgotten. And unfortunately, if Yucatan had become part of the United States then in the middle 1840s, it may have alleviated some of the problem that later led to civil war, because you had more northern states being admitted to the Union in the decade of the 1850s. So, the first U.S. president that dies from the foul water is William Henry Harrison, old Tippecanoe. He had pneumonia and like a cold, but the thing that really finished him off was the bad White House well water. They know because he had diarrhea and vomiting before he expired. So unfortunately, he was the first U.S. president to die from the poor sanitation in Washington, D.C. John Tyler succeeds Tippecanoe. He was in poor health most of his life. He survived the bad water. He is probably the father of our country. He had 15 known children. He was a slave owner, so there could have been some other children that he created also, but we know about 15 from 2 different wives. Good man, underrated U.S. president. He really didn't have a political party that was backing him, because he alienated most of the guys in his own political party. So when it came time for his re-election, his party surpassed him and they went with some other guys. So the guy that John Tyler, operative James K. Polk, who later became president, and he passed away 3 months after returning to Tennessee, probably from the effects of bad Washington, D.C. water and poor sanitation. So Polk left because he only wanted to serve 1 term. He knew he was dying. His health was not good, mostly because of water. They didn't know that. So Zach Taylor is elected on the Whig party ticket. And he unfortunately died July 9th, 1850, from basically poor toxic water. All the hills leading down toward the White House, all the human affluent excrement and all the bad matter is ending up downhill toward the White House. He died when he first came into office. In his inaugural speech, he warned U.S. citizens about gathering in the buffalo hunt, which was the intrigues and the Aaron Burr schemes in those days. He said there's 2 expeditions that are basically being gathered and put afloat right now to invade either parts of Mexico or Cuba, with the War of Mexico being over just a couple of years before. So he warned U.S. citizens about engaging in those buffalo hunts. Now, when he was president, he ordered a naval blockade of the coast of Mississippi. So there was an area called Round Island, a round island in the Gulf of Mexico, where more than 1,000 guys that were ready to go on the buffalo hunt had gathered. He orders a U.S. naval blockade, which irritated the Democratic state governor, Joseph W. Matthews. He was annoyed about that, which almost caused civil war in the year August 1849. Did not happen. Anyway, so Millard Fillmore, he succeeds. He's the vice president. When Zach Taylor dies, he luckily escaped unscathed, the bad water. He does everything he can do to stop the buffalo hunts, the filibustering schemes, the intrigues. He makes it through unscathed. One of the guys that dies from a stomach tumor, probably caused by the Washington, D.C. bad water, Levi Woodbury, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Some other guys, John C. Calhoun. Now back to the part about Yucatan. Was at the time Calhoun said, look, we don't want Yucatan. Yucatan doesn't have any navigable rivers and the soil is poor. But Calhoun didn't know about the cenotes, where the Mayans had gathered their drinking water for thousands of years. Calhoun and Henry Clay, who ran 3 times for the presidency and failed. He's a big bug in our U.S. history. He died also from tuberculosis, as did Calhoun. Daniel Webster, another big politician from those days. He passed away at age 70 from cirrhosis of the liver. So not everybody, not all the politicians and their wives all passed away from the bad water and sanitation. And I don't know how much of the bad water and sanitation affected the other cities in the U.S. So I'm not sure that Washington, D.C. may or may not have had a higher fatality rate than the other big U.S. cities. So Franklin Pierce, Comes in as a Democrat in 1853. He consumes a lot of booze, maybe keeping the bad microbes and toxic water from killing him. His wife was often ill and depressed in Washington, D.C., so maybe she was suffering from the bad water. Franklin Pierce died in 1869 from cirrhosis of the liver. Now, during Pierce's term, he had something called the Ostend Manifesto over in Belgium. With Ostend Manifesto, it basically said if Spain does not want to sell Cuba, we have every right to wrench Cuba from Spain. So in the North, with the Democratic Party people in the North, they were really angry about this because it seemed like a form of naked aggression, basically. So this guy here, pictured at the right, John Anthony Quitman from Mississippi, he's probably the most powerful guy in the South in the middle 1850s. And in March of 1855, he met with President Pierce at the White House in secret talks. This isn't really recorded in history, but I know about it because I've looked into it. So one of the things that Quitman asked of Pierce, Quitman had been Pierce's superior during the U.S. war with Mexico. He was a major general, and at the time, Pierce was only a brigadier general. So Quitman met with Pierce. He says, look, how are we going to get Cuba? I want you to basically override the U.S. neutrality law so I can get an invasion force to invade Cuba, to bring Cuba into the United States as a slave state. And Pierce kind of talked him out of it. At that time, throughout the early 1850s, Quitman had been gathering munitions, weapons, ships. He was gathering a list of men that would help him out. He knew he needed 5,000 guys minimal to have any chance of invading Cuba, which at the time had a force of about 40,000 Spanish soldiers in Cuba. So the reason Spain kept that many soldiers in Cuba was two reasons. One, they always feared the United States, and number two, the Spanish wanted to make counter-revolutions and invade parts of South America, Central America that they had lost to independence movements. So Spain always kept a good armed force in Cuba for that reason. So the National Hotel Disease, January through March 1857, 300 hotel guests are sickened with about 36 fatalities. And this was after Buchanan took the White House as a Democrat. Now what happened was Pierce was not popular with his own Democratic political party, so they did not nominate him for a return run for the White House, where Buchanan was victorious. Now this is Buchanan's nephew on the left, who died from staying at the National Hotel. Buchanan himself is very sick. So this is Elliot Eskridge Lane, the nephew of Buchanan, died from the foul water and poor sanitation. And this is John G. Montgomery, a Pennsylvania congressman, also died. One of the three politicians that died along with Quitman. Montgomery passed away. So the interesting thing about, there's many different theories about how the National Hotel Disease incident happened. Some people say that there were rats that were poisoned by arsenic because the city was trying to clean up the rat problem. And one of the rats that had ingested the arsenic may have been in the water tank. Now that's one of the theories. There were other theories that during January through March, the weather is very cold. The sewage pipes crack and break, and then all that bad, nasty stuff goes into the water pipes in the hotel. So now this is the upgrade of the National Hotel. These are photographs from probably about 1919. There's no original photographs that survive of the hotel. Let me go back one or two. Okay, so this is the way the National Hotel looked originally with these arched windows, and this is after the rebuild, probably in the late 1800s. So this is Quitman. Quitman passes away in 1858. Now Quitman, along with Jefferson Davis, were probably the two most powerful Southern big bugs in the United States prior to the Civil War. They both were military men, both veterans from the war with Mexico. At the time, Quitman was a major general in the war with Mexico, Jefferson Davis only a colonel. So basically, he's one of the most powerful guys in the South that's still alive just prior to the Civil War. So sadly, the outcome of the Civil War is altered because Quitman doesn't survive to make it to the U.S. Civil War. Now, what happens with the national map, I talked about a little bit before, maybe the Wilmot Proviso, a congressman from Pennsylvania, a young guy during the Polk administration. He puts up a proviso where there's a vote on Capitol Hill about allowing slavery in the New Mexico territories. And the vote failed, but they sort of know the writing on the wall. Now what happens is over time through the 1850s, the North has more states that enter the Union. So by 1858, there's now 17 free states, 15 slave states. Okay, so then Oregon comes in 1859 as the 18th free state. And then Kansas comes in 1861 as the 19th free state. So basically, when Lincoln is elected to the presidency, that's sort of the straw that breaks the camel's back, because already the South feels that it's outnumbered on Capitol Hill because you have 2 representatives from each state in the Union. So Lincoln comes into the White House. His 2 youngest sons were probably playing in a sewage canal or a trench near the White House and became deathly ill with the bad water or the affluent. Maybe their sickness was possibly caused by the White House well that we know is polluted at the time, or the scientists now have a handle on that. So Willie perished and Tad barely survived. The bad water may have affected his wife, Mary Lincoln, who later went insane after the death of her husband and the death of her 2 sons. I think Tad perished at age 18 later on in the 1880s. So he was a young man also when he perished. So the only surviving son of Abraham Lincoln's was Robert Lincoln, who survived into middle age. So we're going to talk a little bit about why the aqueduct system was first created. So on Christmas Eve, 1851, there's a fire at the Library of Congress, burns up, I think about 35,000 books burned, along with paintings, important wall paintings, and marble carved busts done by Gilbert Stuart, or the paintings were Stuart, and the busts were just marble busts of Washington, Jefferson, Lafayette. So other priceless art gets burned up in this fire. Now this is not an actual painting of the Christmas Eve fire at the Library of Congress. I didn't have one to go for. This is an War of 1812 painting of the British burning some of the buildings in Washington, D.C. So it's a little bit farby, but I thought it would work okay to describe how and why they start to get an idea for constructing the aqueduct. Now, the real problem with this fire was the firemen don't have enough gravity water flow pressure to put the flames out. Now, they've got hoses that go right into the Potomac River, but there's no gravity flow, and they can't, pump the pumpers enough to get any water into the air to help put this fire out. So the government figures out that they need to build an aqueduct so they can have, good enough pressure to put out any future fires in Washington, D.C. So Lieutenant Montgomery C. Meigs. So Montgomery's first name comes from his wife's family. His mother's name was Mary Montgomery. She was a cousin of Richard Montgomery that our county here in Maryland is named after. So he has Richard Montgomery lineage in his line. There were a couple of other guys, Thompson and Smith, that had done some work on investigating whether to use Rock Creek or the Potomac River to create the aqueduct. I think Smith may have died. Not sure if he passed away from the Washington, D.C. bad water. Anyway, this is a daguerreotype image that was in Meigs' scrapbook. So the daguerreotype is the world's first medium of photography, which is horizontally transposed or reversed. What happened was Meigs made a copy photo with collodion glass negatives. So this is why this is kind of a ghost image. So I put that up there with the collodion glass negative image of Meigs on the right there. So these are some of the engineers that worked with Meigs. Now this also photo was in Meigs' scrapbook that's now held in the Library of Congress. Mostly his scrapbooks was Meigs' writing in shorthand, and he had a few photos pasted in there. Sorry about the poor quality. I'll have to go to the Library of Congress to get a better scan of this for my PowerPoint that I hope to present in October. So these are some of the engineers standing left to right. Alfred Landon Reeves from Virginia, a very prominent guy that we're going to talk about later. Edmund T. Myers, Charles G. Talcott, also from the South, and William R. Hutton. Now, one of the other engineers that Meigs really liked that worked with him was this guy, Claudius Crozet. He was a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars. He was a French guy. He built the longest railroad tunnel, single track tunnel, through the Shenandoah Mountains down in Virginia in the year 1858. It was completed. It was the world's longest. And in 1862, Stonewall Jackson marched his troops through that tunnel and ended up in the other valley, and the Union generals were all miffed because they didn't know how Jackson's guys got there, and they fell on the rear of the Union troops. So interesting story about that tunnel. Now, what was very interesting, I'm going to go through the three different administrations that Meigs has to work with. He has to work with the Pierce administration first, then the Buchanan administration, and then the Lincoln administration in the 10 years that it took to construct the aqueduct. So he was a very good friend with Jefferson Davis in Washington, D.C. at the time, because Davis is the Secretary of War. So the name Secretary of War and Secretary of State goes back and forth between the years, depending on who's in the White House and who wants to use that term. So this is a daguerreotype of Davis and his second wife. Now, his first wife died in Louisiana when they both became very ill with malaria on the plantations down south that he owned in Louisiana and Mississippi. The photo on the left is a pharaoh-type image of Jefferson Davis circa 1860, just before the Civil War. So you can see how sick and ill Davis is with the hollow cheeks. He's also suffering from the bad Washington, D.C. water and some other ailments. It may have been the malaria that he survived in his earlier years that is keeping him unhealthy. We will never really know. But Meigs' father had supplied some medicine to Jefferson Davis's second wife when they resided in Washington, D.C. that made her much better. She was also ill in D.C., maybe a victim of the bad water also. So during the Buchanan administration, there's a guy from Virginia named John Buchanan Floyd, who is from the western area of Virginia. He was a very difficult guy to work with. So Meigs did not get along with John Buchanan Floyd, very corrupt, and he wanted his personal cronies to take over the construction of the aqueduct. So he tried to have Meigs removed, which he eventually did have that happen. Now, Floyd became one of the worst and most incompetent Confederate generals during the Civil War. Later, he lost at Fort Donelson, fled for other guys to surrender that fort. Then he fought he fought previously in the 1861 West Virginia campaigns and had a very poor performance there. But anyway, so now Meigs, who was actually a Stephen Douglas supporter. Now, Meigs was a fan of, we call the little steam engine. So if you can remember from your history, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Stephen Douglas. So Meigs was not really an abolitionist prior to the war so much. He kind of detested slavery, but he wasn't one of those guys that was all hyped up about it. So what happens was when he hears Lincoln's inauguration speech, he jumps on the Abraham Lincoln bandwagon. And what was interesting was Meigs was very tall and slim, as you can see in the photo at the left. And when he had this chin beard, he was mistaken for Lincoln. Lincoln clean shaven prior to his coming to Washington, D.C. When he shows up in Washington, D.C. as president, he now has a beard, the first U.S. president with a facial beard in history. So Meigs, to change his look, grows in a full beard because he does not want to be mistaken for Lincoln. He's tall, he wears a black top hat most of the time. He doesn't want to look the same as President Lincoln. Now we're going to talk about some early aqueducts in U.S. history. The aqueduct in Boston was the first one. So this is pre-Revolutionary War era. Oftentimes in those days, aqueducts, they might have used like hollowed out logs cut in half with wax together or banded together just to keep the water flowing. So this came down from Jamaica Pond in the early 1700s. And the next big aqueduct that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is responsible for building is the old Croton Aqueduct that supplies New York City with its first outside freshwater delivery system. Now this is a photograph of one of the breathing valves for the aqueduct. It's a little bit like your gasoline can in your shed. You want to pour the gasoline in your lawnmower, it doesn't flow so well, but if you open that little air valve on the other side, or back when we were all children, you had a beer can or a soda can where you had to pop it twice with the can opener so you could let the air flow. So these air breathing systems are in place so the water will flow downhill rapidly without too much holdup. So these air breathing systems have to be on all the modern type aqueducts that are constructed. So the aqueduct construction will consist of 11 tunnels, 26 culverts, 4 stone bridges, and 2 iron pipe bridges. So the wedge pieces on the stone bridges were imported from Quincy, Massachusetts. They came down on ocean-going ships, entered the Chesapeake Bay, came up the Potomac River, dropped off at the wharf in Georgetown, and then shuttled up the C&O Canal to the various bridges. So these 6 bridges we'll talk about quite a bit, a little bit more, but this is a photograph of Meigs with some of the iron pipe valves. Now, Meigs himself was a proponent of photography. He learned the art of photography. He had one of his engineers, Alfred Landon Reeves, learn the art of photography so they could document all of Meigs' construction projects. Meigs is also responsible for the U.S. Capitol Dome extension and other government buildings that he was working on at the same time. So Meigs started working on the Mississippi River with Robert E. Lee prior to the war. At that time, Meigs was only a lieutenant and Robert E. Lee was a captain. He liked Lee very much. He got along well with Lee. So prior to the war, Meigs gets along very well with both Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis, and also with this other guy, Alfred Landon Reeves, that we're going to talk about a little bit here. Now this is a photo of where the aqueduct pipe was going to be in the first original reservoir known as the receiving reservoir down toward Washington, D.C. In later years, that reservoir is known as the Del Carlia Reservoir. So this photograph taken by Peel, it shows the brick and mortar round 9-foot tube that would be under the ground. So they do 3 layers of brick and mortar. Very great photo by Peel. Unfortunately, that's about the only one of the aqueduct photos that I do not know the location of. I assume this is probably closer toward the Georgetown end of the aqueduct pipe. You can see the workers' shack, wooden quarters constructed there for the workers. So the aqueduct project would have to include 6 bridges to cross streams and ponds. This is an 1854 photograph of the Cabin John Creek area, the longest width or stream crossing that would need to be spanned. And this is bridge number 1 and 2. So the bridges were numbered from the Great Falls, where the water spillway was, where they had to create a dam halfway across the Potomac River with steam-powered operations, dammed up the river. So this is bridge number 1 and 2 along the lines. And then this is bridge number 3, designed by Talcott, that crosses Mountain Branch. So you can see the name, June 9th, 1858, put on the keystone there on the bridge. This is a photo of that bridge number 3 under construction. So my friend Eric Davis and I had published an article in the Battlefield Photographer magazine, an article called The Names on the Union Arch. So this is the Union Arch that would become the longest single arch stone bridge in the world at the time. When it was completed in 1863, broke the world record. I'll go back and cover bridge number 4 quite a bit, but we're going to move on to bridge number 5. Now this is the first of the 2 iron pipe bridges, and this was constructed over what was then known as College Pond in Georgetown, very close to the Washington, D.C. line. You can see a couple different photos. This is a stereo card photo of the iron pipe bridge. And in the background here is the bridge that was the C&O Canal connector to what would be known as the Alexandria Canal on the other side of the Potomac River. Now, the Alexandria Canal in today's world is occupied by a bicycling and hiking path that goes along the area of the Lady Bird Johnson Memorial. But in those days, it shuttled the canal boats over top of the Potomac River. So oftentimes, this aqueduct bridge is mistaken for the Washington, D.C. water aqueduct. They both kind of use the word aqueduct. So here's another photo of bridge number 5, which crossed the College Pond. You can see the C&O Canal here and a better view of the bridge that took the canal boats over across to the Virginia side. Now, unfortunately, this steel pipe bridge, it's gone from the world, buried under landfill or buried under earth in today's world. So you can no longer see this iron pipe bridge. And sadly, I guess during the 1920s, when they redid some more aqueduct intake lines down farther south on the Potomac River, they buried that bridge under earth. So this is a photo of bridge number 6, the final bridge, the Rock Creek Bridge under construction. So the aqueduct water pipes would be carried in these 2 iron pipes, probably a mid to late 1850s photo there. And this is the completion of the Rock Creek Bridge, the double iron pipe arch, a very nice, well-designed bridge. And unfortunately, in today's modern world, this bridge does not have the same look about it because they laid concrete all around the iron water pipes, so it's not visible in today's world as it was from the late 1850s. So we're going to go back to bridge number 4, the most important bridge and probably Montgomery County's greatest man-made landmark. So this is civil engineer Alfred Landon Reeves, hired on by Meigs in 1855. He designed this single stone arch bridge. And what's great about this color drawing that he made is here you can see that the bridge is actually hollow on the inside. It has 9 mini arches, 4 on the eastbound side, 5 arches on the westbound side, but you cannot see these arches because there's Seneca, Maryland, Seneca quarried sandstone on the outside. So this is a photograph of the scaffolding that was created in the autumn of 1857, completed, giant wooden scaffolding. They dammed up Cabin John Creek where it connected with the C&O Canal so they could get canal boats up the C&O Canal and then up Cabin John Creek to deliver all the supplies they would need to create this massive structure. So Reeves convinced Meigs that it could be done with this longest single arch in the world. Meigs did not know the mathematical calculations and thought that it would not work. Reeves said, look, trust me, I've learned all this stuff over at the school in Paris, the School of Ponts et Roads and Bridges School. I forget the other French word. Anyway, so this is another photograph, great photograph here from June 12th. You can see the wooden massive scaffolding that they're going to create. So what they figured out, what Reeves understood, is that they're going to build a steam engine. They have to build a massive chimney so none of the workers will be scalded by the hot steam. So they have to build this giant chimney to vent the steam engine, where the steam engine is going to lift the giant vasseurs or wedge pieces of Quincy, Massachusetts quarried stone. So you can see the chimney here. Now, another fascinating thing about all of this is that they design and engineer these railroad car type movable lifting cranes that have like a railroad track on the very top so they can move it along to the area they're working. And this is a photograph from December 6, 1858. They had put the final keystone in the bridge in the center on December 4th, 1858. So you can see all the blocks here. You can see the house where the steam engine is. They built this giant scaffolding on top so they can basically have the custom-made railroad cars that roll along on these wheels. Now, this is one of my favorite photos of all of the construction of the bridge that I found at the Library of Congress, and paid good money to the Library of Congress to have a nice scan made of this image. And somebody had written with Chinese white, June 8th, 1859. So I assumed that was the day the photo was taken. It makes sense because you can see these giant tarps to block the sunlight from the workers who are going to be up here working on the bridge. The guys up on top of the bridge look like ants. You can see here the steam-powered pulley hoist lifting two massive Seneca, Maryland sandstone blocks up to the top part of the bridge where they're working. There might even be two men standing on the steam-powered lift with the two stones. You can see the worker in the slouch hat, maybe the stone cutter, watching the activity go on. Now, one of the things about the aqueduct was they didn't always get the money funding from the US government. There were always delays. Congress didn't want to always put up the money. All the different congressmen and senators from the different states, they didn't want to put the money toward the aqueduct, being in Washington, D.C. So there was a lot of stoppage to the work over the years. This is another photo, autumn of 1860. You can see all the massive woodwork. Now, there aren't really any photos which show the building of the smaller arch spans in the center. Unfortunately, we don't get to see that with the construction photos. So, on March 18th, 1861, Meigs wrote a military order commanding that this would be chiseled on the east abutment of the bridge. Chief Engineer Montgomery C. Meigs, U.S. Corps of Engineers. Assistant Engineer Alfred L. Reeves, Civil Engineer. So unfortunately, the man that designed the Union Arch, when the Civil War starts, only a month later with the bombardment of Fort Sumter in April 1861, Reeves, who's a Virginian, he leaves and resigns to become chief engineer of the CSA. So Meigs is livid. He removes the name of the man that designed the bridge and he replaces it with the words Esto Perpetua, meaning let it be perpetual, more or less, in the Roman tongue. So Reeves, the man that designed the bridge, his name does not appear on the bridge. So about this time, they finally removed the scaffolding so the arch rests on its own bearings. And when they removed the wooden scaffolding that held up the arch, it didn't move a millimeter. Everything was rock solid. So here you can see them starting to add just the final few Maryland Seneca sandstone boulders onto the bridge. This is an image from autumn of 1862 where the bridge is just about completed. You can still see the many little railroad cars on top that lifted all of the solid stones up to the top of the bridge. Andrew Russell, the only Army photographer during the U.S. Civil War, hired by U.S. Army. He's a captain. They have him photograph government construction projects during the United States Civil War. So he photographs lots of railroads, the Capitol building, Extension Dome. So this is an Andrew Russell photograph about 1864. You can see the guy standing down at the bottom of Cabin John Creek to give a perspective. You can see all the beams that were removed that held up the center archway. Now, when the bridge was first completed, it did not have any rails on the side. So basically, if you slipped like the man up here, you were falling a long way down to your death. In the early 1890s, with the high wheel bicycles, there were quite a few daredevils that rode on top of the stones on the very edge of the Cabin John Bridge, risked their life as daredevils. So this is a photograph from Russell looking back south toward the C&O Canal where the Cabin John Creek meets the Potomac River. and the C&O Canal crossing here. This kind of gives you an idea of how the barges came in off the canal with all the supplies to build the bridge. They have the pulley lifts with the hoists, all that kind of stuff. So it took a while for them to remove the chimney that was for the steam engine. So what happens? The aqueduct is finally open to the public on the last days of December 1863, brings fresh water to Washington, D.C. So the newspaper Harper's Weekly saves this story in the can. They don't run the story in the winter of 1863, 1864. They wait till May, the spring campaign of Ulysses S. Grant and General William T. Sherman's drive toward Atlanta. They know in the North that there's going to be a big butcher's bill from this final major campaign that wins the Civil War. So they hold the aqueduct story in the can until May 1864 to release it, just in the middle of the bloodbath in Wilderness, Spotsylvania, the battle at Resaca. This gives the Northern public some good news, like a cushy story. You know, it's like a fluff piece of news talking about the aqueduct is now finally open. You know, they don't want to talk about all the casualties and the bloodletting from those massive battles in both the state of Virginia and Georgia. So, post-war, the goddaughter of Robert E. Lee, Emily Reeves, 4 photographs at left. She becomes a famous novelist in the 1880s. She is probably the great-grandmother of all those racy romance novels that the women love to read, you know. And at the time, she married a European prince with the photo up on the left. And she did like all the European women, had herself photographed in the nude, a little bit racy there. And this is Reeves' youngest of the 3 daughters, the 2 parents here. This is Miss Sarah Landon Reeves, very beautiful woman, one of the beautiful women of Washington that was featured in the news at that time. She was a painter. And the 3 daughters basically lived a life of luxury because Reeves was very wealthy and well-to-do, high society people. And these photographs are postcards of the Union Arch Bridge about circa 1904, 1903, when it still held the world record for 40 years, being the longest single stone arch in the world. So the bridge that broke the record in 1903, the Pont Adolphe Bridge in Luxembourg. And in year 2000, I was cycling all around Europe that summer, covered 13 different countries, thousands of miles on my own. And I remember bicycling past this on a rainy day in Luxembourg. I think it was right there in the capital city. And I remember looking at that bridge saying, man, that thing is really huge, you know. And at the time, I didn't realize that it had broken the record of the world's longest single arch, surpassing the Cabin John Stone Union Arch Bridge. So you can kind of see that with this double arch span, how the bridge is also hollow, like the Cabin John Bridge was with these single mini arches. And that helps to reduce the weight, because if there was too much weight, the whole thing would collapse. Now, what's interesting is that this bridge held the world record only for about 2 years. So after that, they go on this massive building spree, you know, who can make the longest single stone arch in the world. Now this bridge is probably like 21st or so on the list. I think the Cabin John Bridge at 67 meters is like 23rd longest in the world. Most of the longest single arch bridges in the world these days are over in China, because there's many mountain ridges in the western part of China that they surpass, you know, have to surmount with all their new roads and railroads in the world over in China. So, in year 1861, on the other side of the Union Arch Bridge, they had removed the name of Jefferson Davis, Secretary of War, carved out in 1861 by order of Caleb B. Smith, Secretary of the Interior. So in 1908, President Theodore Roosevelt has the name Jefferson Davis restored to the plaque on the Union Arch, and that was not an easy thing to do. As you can see the stone cutter here on the scaffolding, he had to he had to basically smooth the entire stone and erase all of the names and writing that was on the plaque, and he had to recarve everything. So that took quite a while to do that. So this is the end. So if you'd like to do further viewing, there's a great YouTube video that was created for Montgomery County, Maryland educational purposes. It's called Washington Aqueduct, pass number 12 at 17 minutes and 36 seconds in length. I advise you guys, if you're interested, to take a look at that. It's kind of nice because it's a live film where a woman that's very easy on the eye, she takes you through the interior of the aqueduct, showing you some of the gears and showing you some of the sluice gates. So if you guys want to take a quick cell phone photo of the last one, I'll leave that up there for a little while if you want to take a look at that 17-minute YouTube video. I don't know, maybe we can watch it here if we've got good Wi-Fi coming in, if you guys want to hang out and have some more pizza, but I guess that's it for now. So thanks again for having me, and I hope you guys enjoyed the show, and I'll be back in about 8 more months to talk about the 2 major reasons for the Civil War, the slavery issue and the filibustering issue. And we know that because in 1862, Lincoln implemented those 2 things, the Emancipation Proclamation and the Homestead Act. And many historians have no idea why the Homestead Act was implemented, but it was mainly to keep U.S. citizens at home and from keeping U.S. citizens with a motivation to invade foreign countries that were at peace with the United States to grab more land. So he gave up this free land, and all you had to do was settle on the free land and stay there. I think it was for about 15 years, and then the land would become yours. So those 2 things he felt were the major causes of the Civil War, and he's correct. So he implemented this Homestead Act for that reason. So, hey, thanks again for coming out. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Any questions?
Oh, you guys, did Nick bring in these stone cutters from somewhere special to do this? Because I mean, this was something different.
Yeah, he put ads in the newspapers looking for workers specifically. And they also built living quarters for the workers, and he would try to feed all the workers that worked on the projects. They would have the meals made for them. He had an integrated dining facility, which had both African Americans and Caucasian workers. He didn't have a problem with that. So he did all that kind of stuff with advertisements in the newspapers, and they put out word looking for the stonecutters. One of the things I forgot to mention was all the sewers that were used on the Cabin John Union Arch Bridge. They all had to be measured precisely to 1/1000th of an inch. So these guys took out like their finest measuring devices before they lifted those massive sewers that became the bottom parts of the Union Arch that you can see here. So these Quincy, Massachusetts pieces of granite are different stones than the Seneca, Maryland sandstone that makes the upper part of the bridge, because the Massachusetts granite had to be really solid and really measured precisely, so there was no give and no play whatsoever. So all put together without mortar, just the blocks wedging on themselves to wedge the pressure. So, and during the Gerald R. Ford years in the late 1970s, they closed the Clara Barton Parkway underneath for just about a year or so because they had to do some maintenance. The Maryland Seneca sandstone, some of the rocks were falling down onto the roadway, and it was kind of a danger, so they closed it all. Now Mike knows because he lives right near the Union Arch Bridge now. He was telling me that they're doing some work on redoing all the lining of a lot of the original aqueduct pipe. It leaks over the years, and from the first leak sometimes during the winter time, so you can see all these massive icicles, a little bit of leakage. So hopefully, later on, they relined the 9-foot diameter inner pipe. They relined it with steel over the years, or, redid it over the years. Any other questions you guys have? Yeah.
I think I read it at some point, but like the creek went under there.
Yes.
And now there's a road.
Yes.
And it's like, when did they do that? I couldn't remember if I read that, like, the creek now goes underground? Or
Yes,
how did
they-
they divert the
Put the creek, I guess, an iron pipe underneath the Clara Barton Parkway.
Yeah.
So it has the creek underneath and the Clara Barton Parkway on top, and then all the way to the clearance
Yeah.
of the bridge. So, yeah.
Paul, filibuster, what's the origin of that word? Where did that come from?
I have it. I'll tell you in 8 months.
Okay.
But won't reveal the secret now.
back.
Some believed it was a Dutch word, but that's not true. It actually is a word from the American continents, from the Western Hemisphere, and I hope to tell you guys all about it when we
Look it
catch up
and then
about
you can discuss it.
8
Yeah,
months from
I'm
now.
sure there's a Wikipedia.
So nobody has the correct definition of it.
Okay.
I am the only guy in the world that knows the original origin from where the word came from, and then how it became a political word.
Yeah.
So I'll tell you guys all about that next trip.